This is the first of two classes that are really about perhaps the biggest moral challenge that we face in this century, perhaps alongside global poverty. We could rank it that order, the question of climate change. So today I'll be talking about one of the the general issues of climate change and how we might respond to that. And on Wednesday we'll have a visitor, Dale Jamieson, who's a professor in environmental studies program at New York University and has written extensively about climate change. And he'll be talking about whether geoengineering is a feasible solution to the issue of climate change. So, climate change obviously is one of those questions that that starts with certain claims about some of the relevant facts and then starts to look at how we might respond to them ethically. So, some of the facts first. This is a chart of annual mean temperatures, and the red line is the 5-year running mean, so it's a little smoother than the other ones, which obviously have more individual variation, and it probably makes more sense to focus on the red line. These are relatively small changes. These are tenths of a degree Celsius that we're talking about. So when we look at some of the predictions for what might happen, it's worth remembering that what we're talking about, the observed change from, well, zero is taken as, I think, zero is the average of 1850 to 1900. So the first, that was a little bit down. And then we're up, but we're talking about being up around 0.6 of a degree Celsius. Maybe that's around roughly 1 degree Fahrenheit. So not very much, but it's interesting that a lot of people think we are already observing significant changes as a result of that, including more extreme weather events, more extreme storms, floods, and so on. Melting of Arctic sea ice is another example. Now, some people say, well, the climate predictions that people made a couple of decades ago aren't turning out as they said because we haven't had a significant rise in the past decade. And if you look at the red line, it's true that it seems to be topping out. In fact, the last particular tiny bit of it is even a drop. So a couple of things to note about that. Firstly, the green bars show ranges of uncertainty. So we're within a range of uncertainty as to whether that is or is not topping out at that level. Second, it's of course entirely possible that we will get periods of downturn or of plateauing. We had one of those there in the 70s, and there's no particular reason to expect that the line should go uniformly upward. If what we are seeing, and we'll come to this, is the result of human releases of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, and so on, that'll only be one factor, and there will be other factors that will be also changing each individual year. Things like the Pacific Ocean oscillation, La Nina, El Nino, things like variations in solar activity. So there's nothing really inconsistent with the hypothesis that we are gradually that the planet is warming because of greenhouse gases, with the fact that there's a levelling out or even a dip at some particular point. Obviously, if the whole graph starts to reverse itself over the coming decades, then that would be inconsistent. But I'd say at this stage, it doesn't really show very much the last few years. Okay, so that graph seems to show that the Earth's warming. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a body under UN auspices that brings together hundreds of scientists working in this area to produce reports every few years, has recently released its a part of its fifth assessment report. So we had the fourth assessment report came out in 2007, and we're now getting parts of the fifth assessment report. In particular, the scientific part, the part that's looking at the science of climate change, has been released, along with this document called A Summary for Policymakers. It's not in your reading list, and you don't really need to look at it unless if you're particularly interested in the science of it. You can certainly do so. You can just Google Fifth Assessment Report or IPCC, Summary for Policymakers, and you'll find it. So they believe that global warming is unequivocal, and that these changes are unprecedented over periods of decades to millennia. They're saying the atmosphere and the ocean have warmed, and they look at separate measurements for the atmosphere and the ocean. The amounts of snow and ice have diminished. In particular, you've probably all heard about the diminishing ice in the Arctic, and the fact that ships can actually now navigate through the Arctic, through the areas where previously it was impossible to navigate. Sea level has risen. I guess we all became very aware of that, or at least a discussion of it, with Hurricane Sandy, in terms of more inundations when you get storms like that, and concentrations of greenhouse gases have increased. Now, there were some sceptics about whether the world actually is warming. Some people claim that this might be an artefact of the fact that these observations largely came from cities, urban areas, and they have expanded over decades, and you get a kind of a heat island effect with a city. That is because cities have a lot of concrete and buildings that absorb heat. That maybe what we were seeing was an artefact of where the observations were taken rather than of the Earth as a whole. And one of those skeptics was a scientist called Richard Muller at Berkeley, who suggested that the evidence was not very good. So he has now changed his mind about that. He actually got some funding from the Charles Koch Foundation. You've probably heard that the Koch brothers are people who made a lot of money in fossil fuel and tend to fund politically conservative causes. So they funded Richard Muller to investigate this hypothesis that global warming is not real but is an artefact of where the observations are taken. And I would guess, though this is a speculation, that they funded Muller in particular to carry out this research because he had voiced these sceptical doubts about whether the Earth really is warming. Well, the research he did, in fact, convinced him that the scepticism was wrong. As he says here, we didn't know what we'd find. We thought the skeptics had raised legitimate issues. Our results turned out to be close to those published by prior groups, that is, by prior groups, the mainstream people who observed global warming, like the fourth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And Muller says global warming is real. So I think that question you could regard as fairly well resolved.